All right, my name is Sean Fallon, and you're listening to episode 37, Justified. Welcome to From First to Last. Hello again, and welcome again. My name is Sean Fallon. This is From First to Last. Today I'm joined by Chris Davis. How are you, Chris?
I'm well. Yourself?
I'm good. I'm very good. Well, as I just said before we started recording, I've got a little bit of a cold, but other than that, I'm pretty good. What show did you choose for us today?
I chose Justified.
Justified. Okay, so Chris, what is your experience with Justified?
Justified came out a few months before Lost ended, and I don't know if were you watching Lost real time?
Yes, I was in the end. Yeah.
So you hopefully you experienced as well that it was just manic. I was listening to like 7 or 8 podcasts. I was watching the show like 3 times a week. It was just insane. Towards the end there at Lost, regardless of what you think of the final season, it was just, what's going to happen? How's it going to end? And along with that, kind of this like, what am I going to watch after this? Like, what could possibly fill that lost shape void in my life? And this, I don't know if you ever did this. This was during a time when iTunes was always putting out free pilot episodes of TV shows. And for some reason, I was always downloading them. And we didn't have... I don't want to be that guy, but we didn't have TV, like we didn't have the coming into the house, so I watched everything on the internet, and so here's this show called Justified, and I don't even know how I heard about it, except that I saw there's a free episode on iTunes, and so I downloaded it, and I immediately fell in love with this show. That's how I got started on it. Probably a month. It started in March. Lost ended in May, and somewhere between the two, after 3 or 4 episodes, I heard Damon Lindelof say that he was watching it and really digged it. So that was just all the affirmation I needed that this was a quality show. But yeah, that's when I started, and I can talk plenty more about why it struck me so well. But that's when we got going on it. Never look back. Watch from the pilot episode the whole way through.
Well, because I had the same thing. Like you say, I watched Lost in real time, and there was that sort of thing. Like it was so all encompassing.
Yeah,
like. Because you watched Lost, and then you read about Lost, and then you talked about Lost, and there was that sense of like, well, when this ends, is that it? Do I stop watching TV now? Do I
exactly
give up? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
No. I mean, just like and not acknowledging all the while how ridiculously all-consuming it was. But anyway, it was just mania. And again, whether or not whatever you thought of the final season, it was just so engaging. And I think too, Damon and Carlton were so much fun to listen to and read. And I'll still listen to anything those guys put out, especially Damon. But all that to say, it was kind of like what's going to happen after this, and obviously no show has matched Lost in its mythos and all that. But for me, Justified, part of what really touched a nerve with me is I actually lived in southern West Virginia for 2 years right after college. I'm from Atlanta, but I moved there after school, and southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, basically the same thing. I mean, the Hatfields and McCoys would say it's different, but the same area, Appalachia, coal mining, some economic challenges because of coal. So a lot of similarities, and I have a real big part of my heart left there. And so watching Justified was like going back to Appalachia for me, and so that there was a very personal component that was very compelling to me as well.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, for me, it was sort of because with Justified, I have actually not watched the whole thing. I think I've only really watched the first 2 or 3 seasons. Like I I finished watching the second season, with the Bennett family and Mags Bennett and all that, and it was so good and so perfect that I kind of took a step back and said, "Oh, I need to take a break from this. That I need to really enjoy this."
Yeah,
and then I moved house, and then I didn't have access to the show and all this, and now it's just come on an Australian streaming channel.
Really?
The past couple of weeks, so now I have access to it. So I'm like, okay, cool, brilliant. I can get back into it. But what happened to me was I sort of got drawn to it because I loved the show Deadwood, so obviously Timothy Olyphant, and I loved The Shield, which like the last couple of seasons of The Shield, Walton Goggins really comes to the fore.
That's
and
what
is just incredible.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, it's an interesting one because I think there's seven seasons of The Shield, and Goggins is pretty much like an auxiliary character. He's a bit of a henchman for maybe the first 4 or 5, and then I think they realised how good he was, and they pushed him right into the foreground.
Wow.
And those last 2 seasons of The Shield are incredible, and mainly because of him, because he is such a goofy, weird dude, but he's so charming, and he's quite scary in his own way, and he's very he's captivating, I think.
Absolutely.
And I think that's when you've got Timothy Olyphant, who's such a charming, good-looking, cool dude, and then you've got Goggins as well as these diametric opposites. You can't help but watch it.
You can't. And I'm not sure how much of the history you're aware of, but they planned to go by the book because the pilot episode is based on the short story Fire in the Hole by Elmer Leonard. And and at the end of the pilot episode, Boyd dies. Raylan, shoots him in the kitchen, or shoots him in Ava's dining room over the food, and he dies. And the last line of the story, basically, I mean, is he says, "I'm sorry" to Boyd as he's dying, and in the story, I think it's Art. In the show, it's Ava says, "Why'd you say I'm sorry?" And Raylan says, "We dug coal together." And that's how the story ends. Well, that's how they shot it. They were very, very true to the story. But then they started shopping it around and doing the test audiences, and they were all like, "You can't kill this guy." Like, Walton Goggins is slaying this role. You cannot kill this character if you want a good show. And so you can even tell if you go and watch that last couple of minutes in the pilot, Goggins kind of gives a, and then the next thing you know, they're carting him out to the ambulance. Like, so they changed the ending of the show, and it's hard to fathom what this show would have been like without Boyd Crowder, but it would not obviously have been what it became, which is you've got kind of the flip side of the coin of what if Raylan had gone bad, what if Boyd had gone good. Like, you could really see them as like twin brothers that could have gone in either direction, and the show totally acknowledges that. And there are multiple through multiple seasons they have conversations back and forth where you see that those possibilities.
Yeah, which is incredible. It's one of those incredibly lucky or like provident things. Like, obviously, I know from our conversations you were a big fan of Breaking Bad.
Massive, yes.
And Breaking Bad had the same thing because of the writers' strike. They were originally planning to kill off Jesse, but they ran out of episodes in the first season, and then by that point, everyone was like, "You cannot kill this character off." And obviously, the idea of a version of Breaking Bad that exists without Jesse,
it's incomprehensible.
It can't work.
Yeah, and those are, same thing with Ben Linus in Lost. Michael Emerson was brought in, I think, for 3, maybe 4 episodes to play Henry Gale. And when they saw the level of acting that he brought to those scenes down in the hatch in season 2, they're just like, this guy's sticking around. and I think at the same time, anyway, there were some other departures like Adewale leaving this show that allowed some more things to happen. And anyway, But yeah, that happened with Justified as well. There was a guy who's in the 5th season who decided I don't want in on the show anymore, and so they had to change some things. But it's part of making movies and TV that you have to roll with. But right, I can't imagine Justified would be what it is without Boyd. In fact, that's part of what makes the show what it is that, and I find this with. Have you watched Fargo, the TV show?
Yeah.
I think that a similar thing is with Fargo's. They both have a source material that seems that so has such a strong and beloved and pronounced voice, and they've both, at least I'll say for Fargo seasons 1 and 2. Season 3 is still up in the air for me, but in terms of seasons 1 and 2, at least they stayed so Coen-esque in those seasons. And with Justified, it is an adapted TV show. It is based on this Elmore Leonard book, and I can't pretend that I've read a bunch of Elmore Leonard other than the Fire in the Hole itself, but but Leonard has such a kind of spare dialogue back and forth. I think he created one time like 11 rules for writing that are very interesting.
He did, and they're very good.
And they're excellent, and you can see it. He breaks his own rules, but you can see his approach to dialogue, especially, and that's what makes Justified what it is. It's the dialogue. I think Breaking Bad probably has maybe over any show, but in terms of plotting, I mean, Breaking Bad is simply brilliant. And Justified has a lot of smart turns. But in terms of pure dialogue, and I didn't watch I've watched a few episodes of Deadwood, not a ton, and so I know that's its own category in terms of dialogue. Yeah. But I have never watched a show that has dialogue that crackles and delights like Justified does. And I think that's why I've watched. I mean, I'll just put myself out there. My name is Chris, and I'm a Justified addict. Hello, Chris.
Hi, guys.
I'm just putting myself out there. Like I've watched probably at least every episode at least 2 or 3 times, and there are some episodes of Justified I've watched 10 or 15 times. I do not get tired of the dialogue, and that's really what makes the show. And of course, dialogue inherently creates very rich characters, and you just seeing these characters bounce off each other is pure delight. And so but what they did in the writer's room is they said, we want to have this voice of Elmore Leonard. So they had stacks of Elmore Leonard books sitting around. And if guys weren't, or gals weren't writing or needed to get their mind off whatever they were trying to figure, they just pick up a random Elmore Leonard book and start reading. And they really, they said that Graham Yost, the showrunner who wrote the first screenplay or the first episode, made little wrist bracelets like the WWJD bracelets, except it was WWED. What would Elmer do? Because he just wanted to make it very clear, like we are having a clear voice on this show, and they kept it. The other thing, I can't scandal. I'm a preacher, so I can't scandalize myself too much, but apparently the catchphrase for what this show was supposed to be in terms of tone was effed up and funny. And so you have, I mean, so they had a vision. They had a vision for the tone of the show that, stuff was going to be effed up. Like messed up stuff happens throughout this show. Like, like people, I don't know, anyway, you could go into it all, but such weird and unexpected. I don't know if you've ever read Flannery O'Connor, a Southern Gothic writer from the States here, but she has,
I've read Hard Man is a Good Man is Hard to Find.
A short story which ends with the criminal like blasting a grandmother with a shotgun, right? And it's that kind of like shocking, abrasive, not for just sensationalism itself, but these kind of crazy, like there's an episode in season 5 where they're tracking down this hacker, and he runs over to the window and he pulls a prosthetic leg off, throws it out the window, jumps to a pole, goes down and gets away from Raylan. And it's just, and Raylan just kind of like raises his eyebrows, like, "All right, more power to you, buddy." And it's just like stuff like that happens all the time, as well as being hysterical for for a show that's as serious and bloody and gory and all that as it is. It has some of the funniest moments of any television drama or comedy I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's definitely a creature of its own. Like, like you say, that whole thing of the dialogue was really good, but they didn't flinch away from like basically like life in Kentucky in the middle, in these places in Harlan, like in these hollers in the middle of nowhere. Bad stuff's gonna happen.
It really
and
is.
And they sort of romanticize it a little bit, but they romanticize it, like you say, in that sort of Southern Gothic way of like, there's an old world in there that people are still kind of holding on to, but at the same time, you've got all this like, because it's all, obviously there's a lot of drugs and there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of guns and all that. So they do have that very interesting thing of like, the show it's a bit of Southern Gothic, it's a bit of a modern crime show, it's a bit of a cowboy show as well.
Totally. Oh, there's so many showdowns you lose track of it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Like they merge all those genres together to create something new, and something that is it's so cool. It's like a capital C cool show. Like, because Raylan is just one of those people who you watch and you're like, yeah, I'd like to be like that. I'd like to have that level of like self-assuredness in the way I walk and all that. It's just wonderful.
I think there's something for me that was parallel between that and in Fargo season 2. That's how I felt about the Patrick Wilson character. That he was just steady. He was a guy that you would want to be, right? Whereas you watch Breaking Bad, and which I'm a massive fan, but maybe I'd want to be Hank without some of the doltiness, but you can't stop watching this train wreck that is Walter White, but neither do you want to be him. And Raylan, not that I would, I have a family and a stable home life. Like I wouldn't want Raylan's, kind of selfishness that leads him to not be able to settle down. But in terms of just him at work and him being a man of absolute standard, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do, even when the Venn diagram of his version of justice and the actual law is not always 100% overlap. So I think there's a quote at one point where Art or somebody says, you're a terrible marshal but a good lawman, and that kind of distinction is very fascinating. But that Raylan is a very compelling character, and yet without all the other characters around him, you wouldn't find him quite as interesting. He's maybe the least interesting character, but definitely the coolest. And so again, you take Elmore Leonard. He wrote Get Shorty and Be Cool.
Yeah.
He wrote a bunch of westerns back in the day. And then after he read The Friends of Eddie Coyle, which they reference in the final episode, that compelled him to want to start getting into crime drama and out of westerns. And so you do, I think with Elmore himself, you have all those combinations in his writing, which just shows. And Elmore loved the show. He adored. He would just hang around the set. Regretfully, he died a couple years before it ended.
Yeah.
But he even like wrote some more stories after it based on Raylan's character, and then they incorporated some of those. He gave it to Graham and said, "Look, strip it for parts, use what you will," and they used some of those storylines in season 3. So
that's awesome.
So it's a really great interplay back and forth. But I will say this just about like you were saying, the old world of Appalachia. And again, the 2 years is not a lot of time, but for me, I was so immersed in the life, just in the middle of life in Logan, West Virginia, this little coal mining town, for 2 years. And, one time I was at the gas station, and this was, I didn't have a credit card, I guess. So I was paying with a check. And this guy behind me, this was in Madison, West Virginia, And this guy behind me says, "Well, there's the man with all the money." And I said, "Buddy, just because I have a check doesn't mean there's money in that account." And he said, "Well, I don't trust the banks. I just keep it all myself." And and that, like, this is in 2002. This is not like 50 years ago, right? And there's this kind of general, because of their history, because of the coal companies and the drive for unionization and the blood that was shed in the early 1900s over that. There's a lot of mistrust for outsiders, the carpetbaggers, and that's where the Quarles conversations just ring so true. Where, Boyd asks him in season 3, "Are you familiar with the phrase carpetbagger?" And Quarles gets so offended, and so he says, "Yes, I know the phrase," and he says it so crisply, "carpetbagger." And he says, Boyd says, "That's where you Northerners come in and take what you want and let us do all the work." And Quarles just says, "Sounds good to me." And it just sets up the tension, but that's real. I mean, there really is still a mistrust of outsiders. The other quote, I was sitting at a mechanics one time in Logan, and this guy started talking about the mountains. And he just started saying these hills, because I don't know if you're familiar with the kind of topography of Appalachia. The mountains are smaller. They're not like Rocky Mountains, but they're much closer together. They're very, I would say, as somebody who grew up in more, less mountainous area, I would say they're more claustrophobic. But for people there, they found them to be protective. And this guy was just saying to me, I don't even know the context of the conversation. He said, "I love these mountains." He said, "They protect us. They keep us feeling safe." And of course, the idea of the holler is the hollow of those mountains, and that's where the stream would be, and people created their communities around the water, and so that's why communities go up and down certain hollers between the mountains. So all of that, and then you get into coal digging, mining, where you're blowing up the mountains, and that's a whole nother story. But all that to say, all of this they just totally nail in the show, and it's stuff that maybe other people wouldn't even care about. But having lived there, it was just so special.
It is interesting when you do get a show where they are so indebted, I guess, to the setting, and they really make the setting like a huge part of every. It's like right in the DNA of the show. Yeah, and very much like, even from, to talk about this first episode, even from the moment he kind of gets to Kentucky and starts interacting with people, you're like, okay, so we've had that little scene in Miami, and you get an idea of what Miami is, but Miami is a million miles away from where.
Oh my goodness, girls in bikinis and eating, talking about Cubans and Jews, and like, I guarantee you, there's 0 Cubans and Jews in Harlan, Kentucky. or girls in bikinis probably. Just a totally different world. And did you see in the pilot they placed that really like overweight dude with a Kentucky shirt in the airport? It's like, come on, that guy's eating his. I mean, I'm not trying to body shame. I'm just saying, like, that was obviously placed. Like, we're going to rural Kentucky, prepare for some obesity.
That's it, and it's amazing, like, how, because obviously, I mean, I grew up in England. I grew up in near Liverpool, and then I now live in Australia. My time spent in America. I've only been to Florida and LA and Seattle and Portland. So those sections like Kentucky and the mountains and all that, they're a completely different planet to me. Like, I only know them via TV shows, movies, books, and stuff. And it's such a fascinating part of the world because it's its own language, it's its own culture, and almost like Justified sort of gives you this idea that it's its own laws as well. There is like I say, it is like the Wild West. It is like this lawless place where everyone drinks jars of moonshine, and it has that interesting thing, like, which, because this is like a genre of something that I've discovered since I left England. Like in Australia, there's lots of this where it's that idea that the setting is in the middle of nowhere. and that creates this weird sort of sense of like, well, you can hide anywhere. You know, you can
Right.
hide in the woods and you can hide in the hills, and it is that thing of, you know, in this first episode where they're looking for Ava's house, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's not on the map.
Right.
You know,
right.
and Raylan's like, yeah, I know where it is, don't worry. And then you see him drive, and it is in the middle of nowhere.
I had a guy tell me one time, and I swear this guy could have leapt right out of an episode of Justified. He was classic, like, veteran, kind of jumpy and a little neurotic, and just doing odd jobs to make ends meet. Used to work in the coal mines.
Yeah.
Everything. He is Justified. And he told me, he said, man, you know, this is going to be, if we ever get invaded, this is going to be the last place they ever come. Because we know these hills and nobody else knows these hills, and we can pick them off one at a time. And anyway, just like bragging about how like this,
Yeah.
when it all goes down, man, it's this is going to be the last place, because it really is like the geography of the place and the twists and turns of the mountains, and driving around. I don't know how many, you know, places you've lived where you've got really sharp turns. I guess Seattle could be this way, but driving around in southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky is like taking your life into your hands, because you've got these narrow state roads that are just 2 lanes, and you've got coal trucks coming around the bend, taking up a lane and a half, and it's like you're looking over the edge of a mountain, a coal truck's coming, and the fatalities on the roads are pretty nasty. It's just its own thing. Anyway, so it really is. And even as somebody, for me, who grew up in Georgia, I don't know if like Australia and New Zealand would be a good example of this, but people like from a distance would look at Georgia or the South and Appalachia even and say, well, it's basically the same thing, right? Just like, you know, us Americans would say, New Zealand, Australia, basically the same, like the Flight of the Conchords episode, right? But like Aziz, but then you get closer, you're like, oh no, there's some significant differences. Like me being from Georgia, going up to West Virginia was just me still being a world apart, even though it's just as much rebel flags and, you know, collard greens and a lot of the same things, but it really is its own distinct culture up there. And again, the show gets it, you know, whether it's Raylan and Boyd drinking moonshine or anyway, the show really nails, and their writers used to go up before every season and spend like a week or so just eating in cafes, listening to people talk, what's the scuttlebutt, and really trying to get a finger on the pulse, and then incorporate that into the writing for the next season.
That's amazing. And and I mean, obviously that definitely pays off, because the place, it doesn't feel like, I can't think of a good example of a TV show that's sort of like, you know, that's like set in a city but doesn't matter, the setting is unimportant. But like with Justified, they've definitely, well, I mean, to talk about this first episode, straight away, I think when you said there about the collard greens and stuff like that, there's a bit where Ava's talking about making dinner, and she's like, I'm going to put a couple of fryers on, and we'll have biscuits and gravy and this. And I was just like, oh my god, that sounds amazing.
I know. I bet it was hungry. Good. Even when I rewatched it the other day, and I saw that it looks like she had country fried steak with gravy on it sitting on the table, and when Raylan walks in and Boyd's got the gun pointed at him, all I could look at was the food, like, oh man, that looks so good.
Yeah, I was sort of like, if I was Raylan, I'd be like, you know what, I'm going to have a plate, and then we can work this all out. I just need to, I need to try a few of these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that is such an amazing sort of cultural thing, like the idea of like, I'll put a couple of fryers on. Like, so is that literally the fryers, like the machines?
No,
you know,
that's, I think that's talking about chicken fryers that you would buy, like basically chicken, pre-done chicken from the grocery store, that they would just call that fryers, that were like fried chicken. Right. It's but it would be the way to describe getting fried chicken, right?
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, because that's okay, brilliant. It still sounds really good.
Well, and even that's the fact that that's how she got her late husband Bowman off of his game, as he had his, you know, I can't remember what she said. Sweet potatoes,
fried yam, sweet potatoes, yams, something else, and
mouthful when he walked in, and
Yeah,
and finish the job.
Yeah. So watching this pilot now for this, what did you think of it? Again, like watching it in isolation.
So one thing that stood out to me that I don't know if you can tell or what kind of an ear you have for accents. I had forgotten how slight or really how Raylan has no home accent in this first episode.
Yeah.
I know that's maybe a minor thing to some people, but did you ever watch Damages?
No.
Timothy Oliphant was on Damages over at least I think season 2, and he played this really soft-spoken character, and it really sounded just like this. This was like a year after that. And it was almost like he had forgotten what show he was on because but as I read in other in articles about this, he intentionally wanted to have kind of a like he had papered over his Kentucky accent.
Yeah.
And he wanted to come back as somebody who just had faint hints of having had an accent. And really, I rewatched episode 2 as well. And once you start watching that, like he really, and I'm sure based on how TV works, I'm sure they were shot like a year apart or something. But he starts to get it more, and then you can hear it build up the longer he's back home, which is a brilliant thing to do. To say here, because the story is about him coming home against his will. Yeah. You know, he doesn't want to be back in Harlan. He left it and never wanted to come back, and here he is back. So that really stood out to me. That here he comes. But anyway, I know we're talking about the episode itself. It was,
but no, that's a great observation, because like that is something that you might only notice if you watch this episode in isolation with an analytical eye as well. And I mean that is an incredible. Like an acting choice and a character choice, because I know from like being someone who has moved away, when I go back to England, my accent is very different from my friends, my family, and all that. And after I'm home for a week or two, that accent comes back.
Exactly.
Because you paper over it. You kind of I was an English teacher for a while, so I had to be like very enunciated teacher voice, and that just became my accent after a while,
Right.
And then, but when I go home, it all comes back, and it's not something that you would kind of think of, but it's a great character choice, a great acting choice. Sorry.
There's a line in I think one of the last 3 or 4 episodes in season 6 where Ava says to Raylan, "Your neck is as red as mine. You just don't see it because you're walking forward." And I think that's one of the most brilliant statements. There are just these every once in a while these statements about Raylan. They don't spend too much time on Raylan, this is who you are, but that was one of those brief ones where it really does set up the nature of the show. Is like here's this hometown boy. This is also, just for whatever it's worth, a theme that's common in Flannery O'Connor's work about the small town person who's been off in the big city. Miami, again, world apart from Harlan, comes back, and who are they going to be? Are they going to be their old self that grew up and dug coal there? Are they going to be their, sophisticated Miami fancy person? And that's a real question, and it plays out in season 1 a lot as Raylan kind of falls in love with Ava, and it plays out over the years. And of course the song they play at the end of most of the seasons is "You'll Never Leave Harlan Alive." And so that's the big question. Will Raylan leave Harlan alive? And of course, that'll play into our conversation about the finale. So that really stood out as kind of Raylan here, kind of deciding whether he wants to really be back home, and they set that up in season 1 in multiple ways by having some characters who live there but hate it. And then that puts him on the defensive about, these are good people. And season 2, Carol Johnson, the coal lady who comes in, played by Rebecca Kreshkoff. She, he just asked her at one point, don't you have a sympathy? No, she says, you really have a soft spot for these people, don't you? And he said, and you don't? And she's just like, I'm off to the next thing. And you can really tell he really does, for all their quirks and and sometimes backwardness. Like, he really loves these people, and he is one of them to a very strong degree.
Yeah, no, and that's great, because I mean, that is a sort of that is an old plot line. Like, you have to go back home for whatever reason and face your past, and I think they do a nice spin on it in the sense that he obviously doesn't want to go back home, but when he is home, it is home. It is like it's a place he recognizes, and they are people who he. I mean, yeah, obviously putting him in that first episode, him versus Boyd, like you say, it is that thing of when they were 19 and they worked together, and then at some point in their lives have forked off into very, very different directions.
Right.
But not huge. Like, they're very far away, but they're not that far away from each other. Like you say, there's only a couple of bad decisions that make it go the other way.
They're still very organically connected in some way, where you still, even though like the tree branches have grown so far apart, they feel like they're in different countries. Like, they're still from the same tree. They're still at the root. They've still got a connection. And that in the pilot episode, the fact that they show that brief clip of the two of them as 19-year-olds, after yelling "fire in the hole," running out and trying to get away from that mine exploding, which the mines are dangerous places to work. And that's part of, I know America's not the only place where people mine. In fact, the way we got bluegrass here is because miners came from Scotland and Ireland and blacks from the deep south, and you throw all those people together and they start playing music together in the camps, and you get bluegrass. That's where this area and of course the sadness around what happens in the mines, and the fact that it's good money but it's easy come easy go, and you could blow up easily, because as they point out multiple times throughout the show, you got to know exactly how to get the where the dust levels are and how far to get the line and all that, or else it could be really really fatal. So to say, it's almost like having been in military service together, like in combat together. And so the fact that just that little clip of those two together solidifies how they've been through a lot, even though one's a lawman now and one's an avowed criminal. One thing that I'll say that's fascinating, and I've heard this listening to Walton Goggins interviews. Walton is from Birmingham, Alabama. I went to school there, and he's a very Southern boy, and born and raised in the South. And when I want to say that maybe when the original script had some references to President Obama, perhaps using racial slurs, and because he made specific references to saying, "I'm not going to do that." Like, I just was his character on The Shield real Southern?
Oh yeah, super racist.
Okay,
yeah, he was.
So he basically said, "Look, I want to represent the South proudly, and I can't just play a stereotypical racist. And so I'm going to, I'll do this, but I want to play a smart Southerner. I want it to be very clear that he doesn't believe any of this, this racism stuff, that it's just a ploy to get his others, to steal money and blow stuff up, as Raylan says. And and even, I can't remember the word now, when he's talking to Jared on the bridge, and he says, he says kind of a 25-cent word, and then he pauses. He says, "You know what that word means, Jared?" And he does that throughout the series, where he has, at one point in season 4, Mike O'Malley plays a thug from, or a big crime boss from Detroit, who comes down, and O'Malley's character, Nicky Augustine, says, "I'm going to have to use Google Translate when I talk to you," because he uses all these 25-cent dollar words, and that was a particular choice by Goggins to say, "I want this to be a smart character." He has this outward sheen of the southernness and whatever, and even the racism at the beginning, but really he's a smart guy. We're not going to let this just be about dumb rednecks. Which
is good. Like, I think there is a thing, like, to go off this first episode a bit, like, there was a runner I saw, was they always had that thing of very, very intelligent villains, but it was usually very intelligent villains with sort of like quite stupid or quite unpredictable underlings. So in this first episode, obviously you've got Boyd, who's obviously smart as a whip, and then you surround him with stereotypical racist rednecks who are intensely stupid.
Right, and actually believe the racism.
Yeah, that's it. So I mean, obviously now it was very satisfying to see, a bunch of neo-Nazis get beaten to a pulp by Raylan.
Right.
Like Dewey Crowe was like, because Dewey Crowe actually is an Australian actor.
Absolutely,
which I didn't know till recently.
Damien Herman, he talks about deliberating whether he would go in there as an Australian to impress them with his range, but he actually went in talking like an American, and then kind of turned on the thicker accent so they wouldn't be thrown off. And that guy is brilliant. I can't even fathom. If I tried to imitate an Australian accent, they'd punch me because I wouldn't even get close. Like how that guy nails the accent so well is beyond me. But yeah, that guy's phenomenal.
Oh no, I had a thing I was watching. I was watching TV over here in Australia, and I was like, oh, that's Dewey Crowe. I was like, so is that him doing an Australian accent? And then I had to Google it, obviously, and I was like, oh my god, because it really just took me, like you say, completely by surprise. Because I was like, no, of course Dewey Crowe's American. He's American as apple pie, like. But no.
That's like who's the guy that plays Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings? That apparently he's Brad Dourif or something like that.
Yeah,
he stayed in character the whole. He's American, and he stayed in character the whole time. And when he finally broke character and started talking his normal like Midwestern accent, the people in New Zealand were like, "That has got to be the worst American accent I've ever heard." And he's like, "No, this is how I really talk." They're like, "Right."
Yeah, whatever, dude. Come on. That's amazing.
So, but yeah, you've got Dewey Crowe, you've got Devil, you've got the two portly fellows who like to chop wood and almost cut each other's fingers off.
That's a great introduction to those characters, where he's just holding the block of wood and it's like, oh, I felt the wind that time. Like, oh my god.
Oh, and it's the little touches like Dewey Crowe forgetting to put the car in park. Those because he, throughout the series, every time Dewey Crowe pops up, you just have a smile on your face. Just for the record, my favorite episode ever of Justified is in season 2, where Dewey Crowe's on that bus, that Oxy bus, to go get Oxy down from Florida, and then he comes back, it gets robbed, and he pretends to be Rayland. I just put a D on the end of his name, Raylan. And goes and steals the Oxy back and just makes this whole big mess. And but he does the same thing in that episode. He's figures prominently in season 5. He does it in those where he forgets to put the thing in park, and he gets words wrong. There's one time in season 5 where he tells this guy, "The anus is on you, man." And the guy's like, "Anus? What?" And so just those little things of like forgetting to put the car in park, messing up words and mixing up things and feeling like he's smart and just being a total idiot. Dewey Crowe is maybe the most beloved character in the whole Justified universe because but he's still an idiot, and that's very clear in this first episode. Yeah, no, it's wonderful, and it is, like you say, going back to what you're saying about Walton Goggins, like he is very much like Boyd is a mastermind who just is unfortunately surrounded by fools, and he's doing the best with what he's got,
wonderful.
or I guess you could say he's doing the worst with what he got.
Yeah, that's even and it's great. And I mean, I think this first episode's amazing because you can watch it. Obviously, because it's based on a complete short story, you can watch it as a bit of a short film. Like it is a complete story. Like there's a wonderful symmetry between the first scenes and the last scenes, where you have like what's his name,
Tommy Bucks,
in Miami, and Raylan sort of, there is that interesting thing about Raylan worrying that he killed him because he wanted to kill him, or did
Yes.
he kill him because it was obviously justified and so on. And then you do have the thing where obviously he shows mercy to Crowder, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful little character piece and a great introduction to so many characters who instantly make an impression. Like Ava's amazing from the first time you see her. Obviously Raylan is, Crowder is. And then also the cops as well, like Art and
Tim and
Rachel and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Like straight away you do get a feeling like, oh, these are going to be a cool set of people who I want to spend time with. Which obviously is the point of a pilot. But when it's done really well, it's wonderful. And it's a great first episode.
It is. And there are scenes throughout the show where... I picked this up especially listening to the AfterBuzz podcast. I listen to every Justified podcast there is, but that one in particular is run by people who are trying to make it in Hollywood. It sounds like, I don't know who any of them are, but they're in Hollywood, and to hear them geek out over particular scenes of like this is a study in acting. This is a study in directing. This is a study in a short, 5-minute film that's just happens to be plopped into the middle of a TV episode. And that's a really bold move that Justified does, where, you're right. If they would have just let Boyd Crowder die and that would be it, you would just stop and say, wow, that was really good. Of course, you'd say, I want to see more, but it has a symmetry to it, as you said, and it's a well-told story. They'll do things like in episode 3, there's these oxy junkies who are having to play what they call Harlan roulette with their dealer. That's like what, a 7-minute scene where you don't know if there are bullets in that gun or not, and it's tense as all get out. And you could just take out those 7 minutes and just make that take it to Cannes as a short 7-minute film, right? Or there's a scene in the final season with Boone, this character at a diner. They're like 2 episodes from the end of the show, and they just let him have 5 minutes to totally psychologically torment the guy, the hipster who's working behind the bar, and it's like there's no reason for this to be in the show plot wise. It's just amazing storytelling and like deepening the psychological stakes that are going on here. And that's the fact that Justified takes time for those types of shots. It makes it the show that it is. And I don't know a ton about television, but as I understand, if you have less money, you have to do longer shots because you don't have time to do 100 shots. You can only do 50 or whatever. And that, FX, the thing about Breaking Bad and a lot of these shows, they're not heavily funded like NCIS or something, and they just do what they can with what they've got. And so they take their time in these scenes in ways that are just so marvelous.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point you make there, because I hadn't really considered that. But there's so much good stuff like in obviously Justified, where it is just 2 characters just sort of, there's a tension and they're feeling each other out, and there's also that weird sense of like I don't know why I think of this as like a southern thing, but just sort of like taking its time, like things will happen when they happen.
Well, we talk like slow, man. That's we're all about it.
Yeah, that's it. And just everything just sort of like, there's no rush and things are going to happen. Whereas obviously you have something that's got more money than any other show with like Game of Thrones, and so much of that is so rushed, and it's just like scene.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, if you back in the first season when they had not as much money and they had to do these long drawn out scenes, that's when the show was much better.
Wow.
When you had that time to establish character and establish tension. And obviously this pilot, obviously it's bookended with these very interesting, slow, drawn out, I'd say gunfights, but obviously there's only like one bullet shot.
Right.
But
showdowns for sure.
You could take, showdown, and you could just take those 2 characters and put them at opposite ends of, the OK Corral and have the same sort of tension.
Yep.
And it's great. There's no rush. It's just, no, things are going to happen when they happen. Just be patient.
Or take the scene where Raylan shows up at Ava's house, and she opens the door, kisses him, which is like, what? They haven't seen each other in like 10 years. And it's like even that. But that whole scene of the two of them, until Dewey Crow knocks on the door, I haven't timed it out, but it feels like it's like 10 minutes of television. And I'm sure it's not that long, but it really takes its time. And of course, like it sinks or swims on whether or not there's some chemistry and believability to both Ava and Raylan. And he's playing that. You see him as the kind of quiet type, and her is the real forward and a little bit flirty but self-assured. And there is this, if Joel Carter and Timothy Olyphant can't pull that off, the show, people are turning it off. But they do pull it off, and they take their time. And the scene is, and it's true to the story. It feels like a short story because of the long dialogue, but boy, it's just another example of how it doesn't feel like traditional television pacing. But the cadence, the overall kind of meta cadence of the episode is just fantastic.
Yeah, it's funny actually you should say that. I was watching it, and at one point my wife came in, and I paused it, and I'd only watched like 20 minutes. I was like, what? I feel like I'm watching this for like 2 hours.
I know.
In a good way, though. I wasn't like, oh god, I'm just slugging through. I was like,
I know.
So much has happened.
You feel immersed in it.
So many I was just in that world.
Yeah.
So to talk about this finale, even though I'm sort of a few seasons behind, what a cracking ending to the show. Just wonderful.
Goodness. Yeah. It's, I turned it on, and for any listeners who had this experience, who just watched the first and the last, did you watch like a couple episodes leading up to the finale, or just the finale?
Just the finale.
Yeah.
First and last.
So that is it was a kind of a struggle for me, because as an episode, it doesn't have the typical narrative structure of, here's some exposition, we're going to lay out this issue. It's really the end of an episode followed by an epilogue, right? And you could even, you could say this about Breaking Bad, where the quote final episode of Breaking Bad is the last 4 episodes. It's not, it's like the story arc is over the last 3 or 4 episodes. And so similar here, where you just pick it up and Raylan's in cuffs, Boyd's been, half blown up, not really, but attempted to be blown up. Ava's in prison. Everybody's in a bad spot. It's what Tolkien called eucatastrophe, right? It's the worst. Helm's Deep is about to fall, right? And really, it starts the episode right at that spot. So it's an odd place emotionally just to jump in. But it's really the 4th act. The whole it's just a very long 4th act to me, because then they've got to figure out, how are we going to get the hero back to where he needs to be? How are we going to get, how's Boyd going to get where he needs to go, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it is. And of course, this brings up like questions of what does make a great finale, what, between Lost, Breaking Bad, whatever one you want to choose, like how well did they do it? But in terms of tying in from the pilot to the finale, just absolutely brilliant. Like the cop, it's just one after another. One thing that I'll say, just as a kind of meta comment, is that as I understand it, Elmore Leonard has a couple of things that are very characteristic to his storytelling. One is he has very strong female characters. And you see that throughout Justified. There's some eye candy on the show, but they're not just there for their good looks. Like, they are consistently strong women who aren't, who are there, who assert themselves, who have something to say, and who take control of situations in very, very powerful ways. The other thing is his main characters do not change a ton. And that's something that we'll get to in a little bit about Raylan in this final episode. But how much are they going to change? Now, Boyd is kind of the wild card here, because the second episode of season 1, Boyd shares his born again experience with Raylan, and then he becomes a preacher who leads a very different kind of church with actually with black people in it, out in the woods, the Church for Last Chance, and then he gets disillusioned with that. And in season 2, he's just a coal miner trying to make an honest living, and then he gets called back into his life of crime, and he becomes a real criminal. He just takes all these different shapes throughout the seasons. What's steady is he's charismatic, he's compelling, he's ominous and scary, so that the character changes, but the venues are always different. But Raylan is really not too much different here at the end than he was at the beginning, with a few very notable President Obama said your point of your presidency is just to move things about 2 or 3%, the trajectory. And that feels like what happens with Raylan. Like anyway, we'll get to that at the end, but it's really a study of like how these characters have come, and whereas in the pilot episode, Ava keeps referring to Boyd as Bowman's creepy brother. Raylan's relationship to him was they dug coal together, and Raylan was in love with Ava by the end of the first episode. Now you get to season 6, and where they all are is just they've been through the ringer in terms of relational changes, and yet they're still kind of who they always were.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think there is, like, for me, like, when it got to the point where everyone was dead except for Boyd and Ava and Raylan in that, like, the shed, I was like, oh, what a perfect sort of bit of symmetry to the first episode. It all just comes down to these 3 characters again. It's these 3 characters and a couple of guns, and how's it all gonna end this time? Is it gonna be like how have these characters changed to the point of like how does this interaction change 6 years later? And it's brilliant. I mean, that's just wonderful storytelling to sort of come back around and revisit something, and to have in the end, Boyd gets taken out in cuffs. Even after he threatens, even after he cajoles, there's no sort of sense that like Raylan is going to give into his anger, which I think is very good. It's a very powerful move from how he did with Tommy Bucks, I guess, if you can compare it to that.
Exactly. I wrote this down. The end of the pilot episode, he's talking to Winona after he scares the mess out of her husband, and he's talking to Winona, and he says, "What troubles me is, what if he hadn't, Tommy Bucks? What if he just sat there and let the clock run out? Would I have killed him anyway? I know I wanted to." And you take that statement about Tommy Bucks, and then you just transpose it to Boyd Crowder. And what you don't see in the pilot, or I mean the finale, is that one episode earlier, Raylan was shooting in the general direction of Boyd as they're in this foggy mountain evening scene. And Boyd's like, "You really want to do this? You want to be the guy who shoots, when I haven't shot at you?" And Raylan says, "I crossed this line with my eyes wide open." And so you get to see a little bit of that in the penultimate episode, but I mean, he's not shooting him like execution style, but he's firing in his general direction. And so there in the barn, Boyd's like, I'm not gonna shoot, and Raylan kicks him. He's like, "I'm out of bullets," so he kicks him the gun. He says, "All right, now we're going to do this." He says, "One way or the other, we are going to finish this today." And I tell you, Sean, I think that was the most tense scene of the entire episode for the finale, for me at least.
Oh, definitely, because I mean that's perfect finale storytelling as well, because there's no reason for the writers to let any of those characters live. That's the thing. That's the wonderful thing when you get to that point of the ending where you're like, yeah, he's gonna kill him, because in 20 minutes the show's over forever, so why not? But obviously and I did think, I was like, oh, I think he's going to shoot him. Or I thought Ava was going to shoot him or something, But no, it was good the way it ended anyway.
It was really almost dumbfounding that he didn't. And yet, what does it say about Raylan if he had? Because you may have remembered in season 2, Doyle, the Bennett sheriff, shoots a couple of junkies because he's covering for his brother Dickie, and and he just says, well, they pulled first. Well, nobody saw it. So it's a sheriff's word against some criminals. And of course he just but that's not Raylan. Raylan is, and so the question is, where is he going to go? And so that, even though, it has in its own, it has a tense feeling on its own, but at this meta character level, you have the question of, is Raylan going to grow? Is anything going to change about him? And I think the fact that he didn't shoot, even though he wanted to, it really says he's a different man. Of course, that plays in the epilogue where Winona, because he says after that in the pilot, I never thought of myself as an angry person. And of course, the scene, they show this like on every single Previously Unjustified. After this, she says, honestly, Raylan, you're the angriest man I know. And so when they circle back around and in the epilogue, she says, you're the most stubborn man I know. And he says, well, it beats angry. So I think upgrading from angry to stubborn that's moral movement, right? That's ethical, going the right direction ethically.
Yeah, that's it. That's good. And I think as well, like, and that's a wonderful move. And it's very Raylan, the idea of like his anger has become stubbornness, so he can still keep that sort of like that code, but there's less violence in it now. It's more just the stubbornness of the law of his own moral code, which is a wonderful thing for the character, and it's a great thing that sort of ties into this eventual ending with Ava and Boyd, which I thought was wonderful. Like, I thought that I thought the show was going to end with him just leaving Ava on the ranch to her own, but for him to have that extra scene right at the end with Boyd where he takes the news to him, and the news saves Ava, because then that's the end of like Boyd chasing after him.
Sure.
Chasing after her. But that wonderful final thing of like, well, why did you tell me in person? Like, why did you tell me in person? And it is just like, yeah, because we dug coal together. Like, oh, brilliant. That is wonderful.
Well, yeah, it is
just,
that.
Yeah.
In my mind, that final scene, and if you kind of reverse engineer it, they can't have a final scene with Boyd and Raylan if he kills him, if he shoots Boyd. And so even for that alone, to say what defines this show is not going to be Raylan getting out his anger, being more Arlo than Francis or Helen, and getting out his anger and killing this man in cold blood. What's going to define the show is the dialogue between these two, kind of dark and white, two sides of the same coin, and they really get to wrap up the short story, because the last line of the short story is, we dug coal together. And they give it to Boyd, but still it's the perfect way to end the show. And there are, throughout the series, there are at least 3 or 4 times when Raylan goes to visit Boyd in prison, and he talks to him on those phones. And there's one in particular in season 2 that I must have seen it 20 times. It's so brilliant, the back and forth. And just those two going back and forth is just it makes the show, and so that ending is just classic. Do you think? Let me ask you something. At watching it, did you get the sense with the Ava, the made up driver's license? Did you get the sense that he was just selling that to Boyd, or like he submitted that to the Marshal Service?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one, because that feels a little bit like that's a bigger crime, I guess, than just lying to Boyd. But that's like nobody ever has to know he showed a criminal a piece of paper, but to submit it to, like, I don't think he would have done it to the Marshal Service, because he could get fired and arrested for that. I don't think it'd be worth it, unless he just really wanted to throw the entire Marshal Service off of the scent. But if he's the only one that cares about finding her, then they're probably going to let it go. But anyway, it's just a side thing. Yeah, I mean, I guess you got to think maybe like he's gone back and said to them like, oh yeah, I followed up that lead that Rachel sent and it was nothing. It's been 4 years. Whatever.
Right.
Let's just
I
wrap
think
it
so.
up. But yeah, no, just a perfect ending and a wonderful like you say, it has that final episode thing of like you get the first 15 minutes wraps up the season, I guess, and then the last 30 minutes wraps up the series, like the whole thing. I thought it was wonderful that you got, because I think they did spoil you a little bit, because you got that thing where obviously he doesn't shoot Boyd. But then you do get that scene with Boone where they have the actual sort of like Wild West gunfight. So you kind of like, okay, well, you get the moral victory that he didn't shoot Crowder,
right?
But then you do get your dessert anyway because he gets to shoot Boone. You're like, okay, perfect.
And you do wonder if they brought Boone in simply for Raylan to shoot him, you know, because that over the course of the series, in the bodies just pile up in the first season. Like he is shooting guys left and right. Yeah. And Charlie, who by the way, when he goes into the Miami office and David Koechner is there, and then there's the other guy they just shoot to real quick. That guy is actually the guy Charlie, who is a retired marshal. He was there for the whole run of the show. He was the one that was hired out to say, here's what marshals do, and at one point, he's like,
"Cool."
And yeah, so they gave him a little cameo at the end, but he was like, "Look, if one marshal was killing this many people, like he would be fired. Like this is a hazard." And so they kind of backed off on how many people Raylan killed in seasons 2 and 3, and ongoing, because like it really got a little outrageous in season 1. But they still, what defined the show was he was a quick draw, and he was he was the best shooter, and he was going to win every time. So they had to, give him somebody to have that final showdown with, and it turns out that going for the heart is a better idea than going for the head, because it did not.
That's it.
Well, I guess you didn't see that earlier in season 6. Boone has this whole speech about how he goes for the head instead of the heart, because you don't know if somebody's going to be wearing Kevlar or something. And so anyway, that it didn't work out for him. But yeah, they really did get to have their cake and eat it too with Boone.
Yeah, that was very much so. Well, we've been talking for an hour and 10 minutes, so we probably need to actually wrap it up, Chris, I'm afraid.
No, absolutely.
This has been wonderful. Like, I love with this podcast, and I did say this to you before we started. It's for me, it's a great. I guess a great joy and a great honor almost to go to people and say, what's your favorite show in the world, or what do you want to talk about for an hour? And this is your platform. No one's going to stop you. No one's going to say, oh no, we don't want to talk about that. So for you, obviously it was justified. So it was wonderful that you got a good, most of an hour to talk about your love for this show. And it's great for me because now this show has come back into, and I thank you because you've brought this show back onto my radar, and now that I know it's streaming in Australia, I'm going to get back into it and watch it, because it is a wonderful, cool, fun show, and it's got great stories and loads of character actors and loads of very cool plot lines, and it says a lot. And also, I love the sort of, it's like a little holiday for me to be like, so that's what Kentucky's like. Maybe one day I'll find myself there.
You should do it. So, show up and I shared the Twitter pictures with you. I took a little pilgrimage to Harlan a couple years ago and bought the T-shirt. Man, it was totally worth the trip, and ate at the Pizza Portal that they portrayed in the 6th season, and which was based on a real place. And it's the people I talked to there said, the only people that show up in Harlan are either lost or they watch Justified. And they want to come see all the spots, and so show up at the Welcome Center and tell them that Raylan Givens sent you.
Brilliant, love it. Okay, well, Chris, if you want to be found on the internet, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter at SimpleMan52.
Cool, and well, thank you for getting in touch, and definitely have a think about other shows. I'd love to have you back on. Obviously trying to think of another show that you love, or I'm sure we could we've already done a Breaking Bad episode and a Lost episode, but I'd be quite happy to do a repeat and do it again if you fancy. Who knows,
would love it. And just so you know, this your podcast, it's a brilliant conceit, and I was shocked even when I saw that you were inviting people to be on who aren't internet stars or nobody's ever heard of them like myself. And so it's a huge honor to be on the show. I love the show. I've listened to almost every episode, and
thank you.
And so great conceit, and I love how you're carrying it out.
Well, thank you. And yeah, it's good. The people's voices need to be heard. I think that's my sort of stance. So, Chris, thank you very much again for coming on.
My pleasure. Stay frosty.
Thank you very much. And if you'd like to get in touch, if you're listening and you want to get in touch, I'm on Twitter at FromFirstToLastPod, or you can email me directly at FromFirstToLastPodcast@gmail.com. Watch Justified and listen to more episodes of this podcast. Whatever. My name is Sean Fallon. This has been From First to Last. Goodbye.